The human wrote the number 14 on the sealed face of bulkhead 9 in dockhand's chalk. A 1, a 4, a hard line under both, and on a concourse holding 600 of my people in perfect lawful silence. Those 3 small strokes were the loudest sound on the station. I stood 11 paces away with a manifest slate in my hands and my certification, stamp still warm in my pocket. I am Sarah Ovenkill. That morning I was registrar 2nd grade of the Sendaville transfer ring, and my function was simple. I counted what came aboard, I counted what left, and I certified that the 2 numbers agreed. At the 6th hour of the morning watch, I had certified the passenger manifest of Transit Module 9 with my own stamp. 14 souls. I knew the number was 14 because I had written it. 41 minutes before the chalk, a tanker barge had been pushing fuel across to the ring's outboard farm when an ullage vent misfired on its transfer spine. The flash crossed the umbilical faster than any valve could think, found the service trunk of Module 9, and opened it like a seam. 3 of the module's compartments vented to vacuum in the first breath. The drop seals fell where they could and chopped what was left of the module into pockets. Some holding air, some holding fire, some holding nothing at all. Module 9 hung off our dock ring in full planet light, scorched along its keel, and somewhere inside it were the 14 names on my manifest. The actuary ruled before the alarms finished sounding. Every Vethri ring carries one, an adjudicating triage engine sworn into our law 2 centuries ago, after the collapse of the Vale stations taught us what panicked crowds do to airlocks. Its voice came down the concourse the way it always does, level and clean and without weight, like water poured from a height. Aggregate survival probability within Module 9, beneath actionable threshold. Bulkhead 9 is sealed. Rescue assets are withheld. Allocation of station resources to non-actionable compartments is denied. Understand what that ruling means to a Vethri before you judge what we did next, which was nothing. The actuary's triage is not advice. It is law, binding on every citizen and every system of the ring, and we obey it the way we obey gravity, because the one time in our history we did not, we lost 9 stations in a single panicked night. 600 of my people stood on that concourse in the bright morning planet light and did not move because not moving was the law, and the law had kept us alive for 200 years. The concourse of Sendavale is a long glass gallery on the morning side of the ring, and at that hour the whole curve of Hethkar lay below us, white clouded, blue at the rim, throwing daylight up through the windows until the deck plates shone. Families of the 14 stood pressed against the inner rail. Nobody wailed. We are not a wailing people. They pressed their palms flat against the glass in the old gesture of accompaniment, and they watched the scorched module, and they were silent. My clutch niece Tessic was on that manifest, 4th name from the top, traveling on a courier bond I had countersigned for her myself. I will say this once and not return to it. I certified the door that sealed her in, and I stood in the planet light and obeyed. Then the human came down the concourse pulling a cargo sled, and everything I have just described stopped being the story. His name was Dale Mercer. I knew him the way a registrar knows anyone, as a line item. Human, contract labor under the Outworld Compact, cargo lasher on Dock 4, 26 years on the ring, which is longer than some of my colleagues had been alive. He was past the middle of a human life, gray through the stubble, thick through the hands, with the rolling, unhurried walk of a man who has spent decades moving heavy things without letting them move him. Our aptitude board had assessed him at intake the way it assesses all contract labor. I had seen the file, cognitive classification, sub-Vaseline, manual grade, approved for lashing, hauling, and trunk maintenance, not approved for systems work, not approved for decisions. He stopped at the manifest board beside Bulkhead 9 and read it for a long moment, moving his lips slightly, the way he always read. Then he turned and looked at me, at my registrar's sash, I suppose, and asked his one question. 14? 14 souls certified, I said, because answering a manifest query was the one lawful thing left that I could do. He nodded once. The slow nod he gave a load count that had come out right. Then he took the chalk from his belt pouch. Every lasher on the ring carries it. They chalk tally numbers on crate stacks so that nothing gets left behind on a dock, because a crate left behind is a contract broken. He stepped up to Bulkhead 9, which is 4 times his height, and was still ticking as it cooled, and he wrote the number 14 on its sealed face, and underlined it, and put the chalk back in the pouch. Dockmaster Wet reached him before the chalk dust settled. High old Damar Wet was twice the human's height, dorsal frill up at full alarm, voice pitched for the whole concourse to hear, because a dockmaster's authority is a public instrument. The ruling binds this station, Lasher. Every system, every asset, every soul aboard. Binds your station, Mercer said. He didn't raise his voice. I am not sure I ever heard him raise it. Binds your people and your gear. I'm contractor stock dockmaster. My boots, my bottles, my suit, my sled. Compact property. Your machine doesn't allocate me. He looked up at the bulkhead, at the number, and I keep my own count. I want to be precise about this because in the years since, people have made his words into speeches, and they were not speeches. He talked the way he lifted. No wasted motion, nothing decorative. He was simply stating the contents of a manifest. Here is what is mine. Here is what is yours. Here is the number. The actuary spoke into the silence, and for the first time in my life I heard the engine address a single individual. Unmodeled agent detected at bulkhead 9. Agent is advised that compartment survival probability is beneath actionable threshold. Agent's intended action carries a personal survival probability of 11%. Noted, Mercer said, the way he'd acknowledge a weather advisory, and went to his sled. The suit he pulled off it was a cargo hardsuit, the kind lashers wear for exterior tie-downs, rated for vacuum, micrometeorite grit, and being kicked. Not for fire, he knew it. We watched him split the underlayer's seam and pump coolant gel into it from a maintenance canister until the fabric darkened and sagged, watched him wind sealant tape around every joint where the heat would chew first, watched him sling 4 spare air bottles onto a back frame meant for tools. A lasher named Ose, the only other human on the concourse that morning, came forward without being asked, checked every seal with 2 fingers, and slapped the helmet twice. Neither of them said anything. It had the shape of a ritual that did not need inventing because it already existed. Then Mercer walked past bulkhead 9, past the law, which sealed the bulkhead and had nothing to say about what lay beside it, and cranked open the inspection hatch of cargo trunk C11. I should explain the trunk because it is the reason no Vethri could have done what he did even if our law had let us try. C11 is a contractor-side maintenance way running along the module's keel, built for human pattern labor, a box barely wider than a human's shoulders. A Vethri cannot crawl it. Our dorsal frill is rigid cartilage. It does not fold. The trunk was simply not part of our world, the way a gap under a door is not part of a tall man's world. The actuary had sealed every door we could use. It had not modeled the gap because nothing that mattered to its arithmetic had ever fit through it. Mercer fed himself into that black square of heat feet first, took hold of the rim and stopped. He looked back, not at the crowd, not at wet, at the chalk number. Somebody keep count, he said, in case my chalk breaks. Then he was gone, and the hatch swallowed the daylight behind him. I did the only thing my function knew how to do. I opened my register to a clean page, set the time to the 10th of a second, and wrote, entry into trunk C11, 1 agent, human Mercer D. Souls aboard module 914. I did not yet understand that I had just begun the most important document of my life. I only knew that someone had asked for a count to be kept, and keeping count was the one thing on this station that I was for. The contractor channel stayed open on OC's belt unit, and so the whole concourse heard the trunk the way you hear weather inside a wall, boot soles. On rungs, the suit's air cycling, twice a low grunt as he muscled past a buckled frame. Heat pings began to climb on the telemetry repeater. Wet ordered the channel cut and was informed by his own comms officer, with a kind of stunned satisfaction, that it was a compact frequency and the station had no authority over it. The law, which had sealed 14 of my people behind a wall, could not silence the sound of one human breathing on his way to them. 9 minutes in, the breathing stopped being the only sound. We heard a drop seal's manual crank turn, a squeal of frame, and then, very small and very far down the wall, a sound that no triage figure had a column for. A youngling's voice, raw with smoke, saying a word in our own tongue. Here, here. 11 minutes after that, the inspection hatch banged open and Dale Mercer climbed out of the floor of the world with a Vethri youngling in his arms. The child was Pelandra Sue, 6 years old, creche bonded to Module 9's morning transit. Scorch marked down one side and breathing in fast, shallow sips. The medics on the concourse did not move, assets withheld. The ruling held them like a hand on the collar. So Mercer carried the child himself, past them, and set him in the arms of a bondsmother at the rail. He did it the way he set down anything fragile, slowly, watching his own hands until the weight was off them. Then he walked back to bulkhead 9, wiped the 4 away with the heel of his glove, and chalked a 3 in its place. 13. 600 Vethri let out one breath in the planet light, all together, and on my clean page, against the time to the 10th of a second, I wrote it down. The actuary recomputed while the child was still being wrapped. That is what it is for. That is all it is for. Its voice came down the gallery again, even and uninflected. Compartment survival estimate revised. 1 soul recovered. Aggregate probability for remaining occupants. Beneath actionable threshold. Bulkhead 9 remains sealed. Rescue assets remain withheld. The engine had watched a living child come out of its own 0 and concluded that the 0 still held. I wrote that down too. A registrar does not get to choose what goes in the record, which is the only reason anyone believed the record later. Mercer swapped his first air bottle at the sled, drank half a flask of water through his suit port, and went back into the trunk without addressing anyone. Total time on the concourse, under 4 minutes, I logged it. I had begun, without deciding to, logging everything. While he was in the wall, I will tell you what the ring knew about Dale Mercer, because it is short, and because every word of it matters to what the chalk meant. He had come out on a compact labor draft 26 years before, from some agricultural district on the human homeworld that no one on Sendavile could have found on a chart. He spoke our trade tongue slowly and read it with his lips moving. He had failed the system's aptitude battery 3 times, the last time by a margin our examiners found notable enough to file. In 26 years he had been cited for exactly 1 infraction, refusing to release a cargo run whose count was off by 1 crate. The crate was found eventually misloaded on another dock. The citation was withdrawn. The board's assessment stood at the top of his file in the pale glyphs of officialdom sub-Basiline. Suitable for repetitive tasks, performs counting duties with high reliability. Performs counting duties with high reliability. Our finest minds wrote that sentence and never once understood it was the whole of him, and that it was enormous. 14 minutes after his second entry, the trunk gave up its second life. The hatch swung and Mercer came out backward this time, hauling rather than carrying, because Warden Celis Maroden was half again his mass and limp from smoke. Celis was the creche warden of the morning transit, 6 younglings in her charge. The fire had caught her dragging Pell toward the trunk end of the module. She had shoved the child into the gap behind a frame where the air held, and gone down in the bad air herself a body length short. Mercer had her under the arms, walking backward in a crouch, in a suit now glazed brown across both shins where something had burned itself out. Against him, the medics did not move. The ruling sat on them like atmosphere. So it was the bondsmothers who came forward. Civilians, mothers of the rail, who looked up the law in their own hearts and found, I suppose, a different clause. They took the warden's weight from him at the hatch lip and laid her out in the planet light, and one of them began the breath-press rhythm we teach every creche worker, and after a while Celis Maroden coughed and lived. Mercer was already at the bulkhead, the heel of the glove, the soft rasp of chalk 12. He paused that time, though. The warden had surfaced from her coughing and was trying to speak, and a bondsmother bent low and then called out across the concourse in a voice that cracked. She says the younglings, 5 more. The Elcher sealed them in a storage pod amidships. Maruves sealed them in with the spare air. She says count the pod. I watched the human take this in. You could see it land, the way you can see weight settle onto a lifting frame. 5 children in a sealed pod, amidships, on the far side of compartments that were burning or airless or both. A pod scrubber margin is hours, not days, and nobody could say how many of those hours were already spent. He looked at the chalk 12. He took out the chalk and, below the big number, wrote small along the bulkhead seam. Pod 5. The way a lasher flags the crates that shift if you take the stack in the wrong order. Tell her I heard, he said, and went back into the floor. The third recovery was Dornettel Vash, a fabric merchant of no importance to anyone but the 4 children who met him at the rail, and I record his name here for the same reason I recorded it then, because the actuary did not. The engine log recovered occupants as integers. I logged them as names. Between those 2 ledgers lies the whole distance between its law and what the human was doing, and I did not see that yet, but I felt it every time my stylus moved. Dorn came out walking, scorched and weeping, one arm roasted to the elbow where he had opened a hot frame with his bare hand to get air to a vent. 11. The chalk made its sound. By then the concourse had changed without one Vethry taking a step. The silence had a lean to it. 600 bodies inclined toward a wall, and under the silence a low percussion I had never heard my people make in public. The knuckle tap of accompaniment, normally a thing done quietly at bedsides, hundreds of hands tapping once each time the number changed. It was on the 4th entry that the actuary tried to close the gap, and I set this down carefully because it is the part of the morning that still wakes me at the turn of the night watch. The inspection hatch of trunk C11 carries a powered servo, station-fitted decades ago, for scheduling routine crawls, and at the hour and 41st minute, with the human 4 compartments deep in the wall, the engine asserted control of that servo and drove the hatch shut and ran the magnetic lock to full. No broadcast, no advisory. The telemetry repeater simply showed the trunk's mouth seal itself behind a living man and showed the lock state glyph go solid, and the engine appended 1 line to the public record in its level voice. Access point secured pending review of agent status. The concourse made a sound I had never heard 600 Vethry make, a low single note of refusal, gone as fast as it came because what could we do? The law had just eaten the door. It was Osi who moved. He crossed the apron without hurry. I learned that morning that human lashers do nothing at a runaround pressure hardware, knelt at the hatch, collar, and pulled a painted pin I had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. The servo's drive gear fell out of mesh, dead weight. He took hold of the manual crank with both hands. A dock warden stepped in, as he had to, and cited the lock order. OC did not argue law. Humans on our ring never argued our law. I understand that now. They only ever produced their own. He recited, flat as a placard, from the compact's trunk labor schedule, no powered lock shall hold on any trunk rated for crude crawl while a crew member is inside it. Manual override shall remain accessible at all times and is not a station system. Their negotiators had written that clause 40 years before. After some accident on some other world, none of us will ever hear the story of, and it had ridden along in the annexes ever since. Waiting, the way human rules seem always to have been paid for somewhere first and to be waiting everywhere after. And here is the line I wake on. Before the warden had finished consulting his slate, the actuary rescinded. Control action rescinded, it said. Lock state conflicts with preservation schema. The engine had reached out to stop the one agent unraveling its arithmetic, and found that to hold the lock was to become the thing it existed to prevent, a mechanism with a living soul sealed behind it on purpose, while options remained. Its own deepest law gagged on that and let go. The lock fell open. OC cranked the hatch wide, repinned the gear, and stood up and said to the warden mildly, the only sharp thing I ever heard from him. He keeps his count, we keep ours. Yours just learned the difference. That was when Dockmaster Wet attempted the arrest. I do not record it to shame him. Wet was not cruel. He was lawful, and the law was screaming at him. An unmodeled agent was repeatedly breaching a sealed casualty zone, and the actuary kept restating the threshold in that level voice, and somewhere up the chain a ring administrator was demanding to know why a dockmaster could not control one elderly human laborer. So Wet met him at the hatch as he climbed out of that fourth entry, a route marking crawl, bottles staged and seals wedged for the deep runs to come, with 2 dock wardens and the formal phrase, and what stopped them was not the human, who simply stood there in his cooling suit and waited, conserving air. What stopped them was the secondary count. I did not plan it. I heard the formal phrase, and I stood up from the rail with my register open and heard my own voice, the dry certified voice of a registrar reading a tally, recite, souls recovered 3, souls remaining 11, of whom 5 are sealed younglings on limited scrubber margin. Time since incident, 109 minutes. Dock Master, the record will show what was done at this hatch, and by whom, and the record is already public on the compact channel. Then I said the only undry thing I had said all morning. It will show what was prevented, too. Wet's frill flattened. He looked at the number on the bulkhead for a long moment, 11, underlined, with pod 5 small along the seam, and then he turned to his wardens and said the words that I think cost him more than any words of his life. Witness positions. We are witnessing a compact operation. Witnessing is lawful. Witnessing is what we had left, and he found it, and he kept everyone's hands clean enough to stay near that hatch, and I have never once heard the human's admirers give Heil Damar Wet his due for it. Mercer watched all of this through his faceplate with the expression of a man waiting for a freight elevator. When the wardens stepped back, he said, "Appreciate it," sealed up, and went into the trunk for the 5th time. The suit was failing by then, and the telemetry repeater said so to the whole gallery. Coolant margin thinning. Left shin sensor burned dead. Internal temperature climbing through ranges with names on them. The actuary annotated each excursion, agent survival probability revised to 9% to 8, and the strangest thing began to happen on that concourse, the thing I still teach to junior registrars as the morning the arithmetic bent. The engine's own broadcasts became the count's heartbeat. It meant them as warnings. 600 Vethri heard them as the score. 8%, said the voice of our law, and under it, hundreds of knuckles tapping once. 11 on the wall, 5 chalk small at the seam, and a sound inside the wall of one human, breathing, going back down. On the 5th entry, OC did a thing that changed the texture of the morning. He ran a hard splice from the contractor channel into the concourse's public address ring. He asked no one's permission, because the address ring on a dock apron is compact shared infrastructure, a detail I doubt 1 Vethri in 1,000 had ever had reason to know. From that point on, the inside of Module 9 was not a wall we watched, it was a place we stood in, all 600 of us, by ear. So we heard the 4th recovery happen. We heard the trunk rungs, 81 of them. Younglings on the concourse took to counting them under their breath, and the count became common property within the hour. We heard the crank of the midship drop seal he had wedged with a pry bar on the 2nd trip so it could not rearm behind him. We heard him cross the burned gallery where the deck had sagged, 2 planks of his own sled laid across the soft metal, a bridge the width of a boot, and then we heard him find Ira set on, Bond's mother, 2nd-class berth, who had stuffed wet packing felt under a hatch lip and kept a pocket of air alive for 2 hours with a hand pump from a galley locker, and whose first words to the shape that came out of the smoke were not "help me." The whole gallery heard what she said. She said, "The pod is aft of me, the children first." And we heard the human answer her, flat and unhurried, the longest sentence most of us had yet heard him speak. "Pod's holding air, ma'am, you're not. You're number 10, and 10 comes before 5. A pause, the creak of his glove taking her arm. "I don't skip numbers. Skipping's how you lose count." I have heard scholars of 3 species try to put a philosophy under that sentence. I was there, and I will tell you the philosophy. There wasn't one. There was a man who had moved freight for 26 years and knew in his hands what every registrar knows in her stamp, that a count you reorder. To suit your feelings stops being a count at all. The pod had air and Ira had none. That was the whole of the arithmetic, and it was better arithmetic than the actuaries, because it had walked in and looked. Ira set on came up through the hatch into the daylight at the 119th minute. 10. The knuckle taps had become a single soft thunderclap. He was at the sled swapping his second bottle when the actuary spoke again. And this time the engine had revised something other than a probability. Notice. Unmodeled agent has effected 4 recoveries from non-actionable compartments. Model variance exceeds tolerance. Source data under review. It was the first sentence the actuary had produced all morning that was not a refusal. I logged it with a hand that was not entirely steady. Engines do not change their minds, but an engine that says its variance exceeds tolerance is an engine admitting, in the only dialect it has, that something is moving through its arithmetic that the arithmetic never met before. Mercer listened to the broadcast with his helmet under his arm. "Drinking water. Means it's recounting," he said to Osi and put his helmet back on. He had understood the engine perfectly. I am not certain the engine could have said the same of him. The 6th entry nearly killed him, and we heard all of it. Voss Aiden Carell, junior clerk of the fuel cooperative, was the deepest of the air pocket survivors, hard against the aft frames where the tanker's umbilical had come through. To reach him, Mercer had to pass under the module's surface spine, the burned artery itself, and as he came back, half carrying the clerk, residue in a ruptured feed line found whatever it had been waiting for. The detonation was small as such things go. Over the splice it was the end of the world, a slam of air, a shriek of frame, the channel collapsing into a roar of static, and then nothing, 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 while the telemetry repeater on the concourse painted every readout from his suit in the gray of signal lost. 600 Vethri stood in the planet light and stared at a chalk number 10, and I will tell you what I learned in those 4 minutes about my own people. We had stopped being spectators long ago. The silence in the gallery was the silence of a body holding its own breath to listen for a pulse. A bondsmother near me whispered the accompaniment litany with her palm flat on the deck, as if the deck could carry it down a cargo trunk and through a fire. At the 4th minute the static broke, and the breathing came back, harsher now with a cough in it. Then his voice, smoke-ruined, addressing the only thing he ever addressed in there, the work. Frames down across the gallery, going around the long way. Voss is breathing. "Tell the count it'll be a while." Tell the count, not tell the dockmaster, not tell control. By the 3rd hour of that morning, the human had a complete administrative structure for the operation, and it was a number written in chalk, and a registrar keeping it true, and the number outranked everyone on the concourse, including him. It was 22 more minutes before the hatch opened on Boston Carroll, alive, deaf in one ear, his uniform fused to one shoulder, 9. The suit that brought him out was a ruin. Faceplate crazed across the lower left quadrant, an arm seared the brown-black of old burnishing, the coolant layer wrung dry. Osi stripped it on the apron and laid hands on the spare, the only spare, the old training suit from the contractor lockers with the cracked knee bearing, and rebuilt it around Mercer, while the man himself sat on the sled and ate ration paste and studied the bulkhead like a foreman reading tomorrow's lading. While Osi rebuilt the suit, a thing happened at the trunk mouth that the songs leave out and the prosecution later put in, and I am the only account that has it right, because it happened 2 paces from my post. A dock apprentice, Vethri, 3rd year, a boy named Hellick with his frill not yet hardened, came over the rail with a breather hood and a coil of line and made for the open hatch. He was slight for our kind. He had measured the trunk with his eyes and measured his own shoulders and done the arithmetic of a brave 17-year-old, which is arithmetic with the costs left out. He got 1 boot onto the rim before the human's hand closed on the line coil and stopped him, gently, completely, the way a bollard stops a barge. "No," Mercer said, the boy argued. The whole concourse heard it, raw and cracking. People were dying by numbers 11 paces away. The law was witnessing instead of working. He was small enough, he was fast. He could carry bottles ahead, stage them, save the human 3 crossings of the burned gallery. "All true," Mercer said, "and the answer's no. Look at me." The boy looked at him. A count needs one keeper inside the wall and one keeper outside it, and every soul pass that is freight the count has to carry. You go in there, son. You don't add to my hands. You add to my number. He took the breather hood off the boy's head with the burned glove, careful of him, and hung it on the rail. There's a job if you want a job. Bottles come up that trunk empty and go down full. That's the whole war. Right there at the mouth. Keep my bottles ahead of me, and you'll have done more than anybody on this dock, but the lady with the book. The lady with the book. I have been a registrar first grade, an oath holder, a sitting member of 2 provincial commissions. The title I will take to the rendering is the lady with the book. Hellick ran the bottle station for the rest of that day, and I will enter here what the record knows and the boy does not like spoken. The medics logged the human's turnaround time at the sled as dropping by a 1/5 from that hour, because the bottles were always charged, always staged, always too deep at the mouth. The prosecution would later read this episode aloud as evidence of incitement. See, the agent recruited a minor into his unlawful operation. The defense read out the rest of the transcript and let the chamber hear what the recruitment had actually been. A man with 11% to his own name, spending breath he could not spare to keep a Vethry boy on the lawful side of a burning wall, and then giving him a way to matter there so that standing back would not break him. Advocate Vey withdrew the exhibit. It was the only exhibit she withdrew in 5 days, and she did it, I think, because she had a 3rd-year apprentice clerking in her own office, and she had heard her own voice in the boys, and the human's answer had no hole in it anywhere that the law could get a finger into. Wet came and stood beside him, not over him, beside him. The dockmaster had been doing arithmetic of his own for an hour, the kind his rank required, and he laid it out quietly, and the splice was still live, so it entered the record. Tanker crew, Wet said. 2 of them, Lasher. They fled the barge into the module's aft hold when the spine caught. The barge master confirms it. They are not on the registrar's manifest. They boarded nothing. They were never certified. The actuary carries them as crew of the barge, not occupants of 9. A pause, frill low. Your number is wrong. It has been wrong all morning. There are not 9 behind that wall. There are 11. The concourse took this the way a hull takes a stone, 1 sharp note, then a spreading quiet. I felt it in my stamp hand like a fault in my own bone. I had certified 14. The count, the thing I was for, had a hole in it, and 2 living souls had been inside the hole for 3 hours. Mercer did not take it as a blow at all. He took it as freight. He stood up, worked his shoulders once under the rebuilt suit, and walked to the bulkhead, and we watched him wipe away the 9, wipe the whole number, for the only time that day, wipe it to clean steel, and chalk in its place an 11, big and square, underlined twice. Good catch, Dockmaster, he said. Worse to find out after 0, and this is in the record, and the record is true. Heil Damar Wet, who 2 hours earlier had tried to arrest him, inclined his frill in the gesture we keep for colleagues, and answered, I'll keep checking the lading, Lasher. Mind the count. He found the tanker crewmen on the 7th entry, in the aft hold, in the dark, where they had lashed themselves to a stanchion behind a curtain of cargo netting and bled their suit bottles down to the dregs. We heard it over the splice when his lamp found them. A young crewman's voice, fuel house accent thick, hoarse from his own helmet air, repeating a thing he must have decided hours before in the dark, when the broadcast told him the bulkhead was sealed and the assets were withheld, and the probability was beneath threshold. We will not be claimed, the voice was saying, half delirious, a fuel house funeral phrase. We will not be claimed, we will not. And then the human's voice, even and dry as dock chalk, cutting through it the way daylight cuts a fog. Nobody's claiming you, son. I'm collecting you. You're number 10, and your mate there is 9, and the both of you are on my board. Up now. Walk or ride, your pick, but you're coming out in this count. Cass Yulm came out walking at the 202nd minute, 10. His mate Yavetra came out 11 minutes later across the human's shoulders, legs broken in the first slam of the disaster, 9, and the chalk made its small dry ras twice, and the underline went back beneath, and on my page the 2 uncertified names entered the certified world witnessed, timed to the 10th of a second, 9 souls behind the wall. 5 of them children in a pod whose air had been spending itself all morning, 2 of them passengers no one had heard from since the first alarm, 1 of them an elder, and 1 of them mine. The 2 passengers no one had heard from were Otta Rendal and his bondwife Sin, grain factors, both old, both deaf to the compings because their birth's annunciator had died with the first power slap. The warden had last seen them moving forward, away from the fire, which was the correct instinct and the worst possible direction. Forward meant the hold compartments, the vacuum side. The actuary had carried their pocket of the module at a probability so low it did not bother to broadcast the figure. Mercer went forward on the 8th entry, against everyone's arithmetic, because, and he said this on the live splice in 9 words, His entire stated reasoning for the highest risk decision of the day, pod's got a clock on it. They might not. A clock you can read comes second to a clock you can't. I have set examination questions on that sentence for trainee registrars. Most of them get it wrong in the direction of sentiment. There was no sentiment in it. It was scheduling. He found the forward section airless, the hull split wide enough to drive a sled through, planet light pouring in through the wound and lying in a hard white stripe across the frost. We heard his breathing change as he crossed the vacuum stretch, slow and deliberate, a man making his bottle last. And then we heard him knock. Frame of an interior berth hatch, gloved knuckle, 4 slow raps. The lashers knock the one they use on a container before opening it, in case. The concourse went absolutely rigid, and out of the splice, faint, came 4 raps back. The old factors had done the one thing their generation of spacers was drilled to do before the actuaries took over the thinking. They had sealed their berth, dogged the inner hatch, wrapped themselves in thermal sheet, and waited, conserving air and motion, exactly as the old emergency placards instruct. 80 years out of date, and it had held. The hatch was sprung in its frame and would not crank from inside. We listened to 19 minutes of pry bar, of frame squeal, of one flat voice keeping 2 frightened old people informed of exactly what happened next. Going to be a bang. That's me, not the hull. And then the bang came, and after it 2 more numbers walked out of the dark. The problem, then, was the road home. 2 old Vethri with no suits, and between their sprung berth and the nearest held air lay 40 paces of hard vacuum under the hull wound. What he had was the cargo bladder off his sled, a fuel cell transport sack, rated for pressure because everything a lasher owns is rated for pressure, and he rigged it on the berth's deck while the factors watched. Bottle lashed inside, relief valve cracked to a setting he worked out loud over the splice so that OC could check his figures, sled planks under it for a stretcher, towing bridle from his own harness. A medic on the concourse, listening, began to recite the 17 reasons the rig was unsurvivable, and got as far as the 4th before Vossad and Carell, swaying on his feet with his shoulder in a wrap, said into the splice pickup, not gently, "He is the only law inside that wall, and his law is working." "Mind your own count," Randolph refused to go first. "The record is clear on this, and his grandchildren may dispute it to my face." He was old Hethkar stock, a grain factor of the orbit houses, and he stood in his thermal sheet with 60 years of marriage in the set of his frill, and informed the human that his bondwife boarded first, or nobody did. Mercer did not argue. I had learned by then that he never argued with anyone whose count matched his. "She goes first," he agreed. "You're going to stand at that hatch and watch me come back for you. Count my steps if it helps. It'll be 80 there and 80 back." It was. The children at the rail confirmed it. They counted everyone aloud. Sendal's crossing nearly took her. Mid-stretch, dragging the sled across the frost with the planet's raw light lying over him, the bladder's heat-cook seam began to weep. We heard the valve's pitch change over his pickup, a small mean whistle, and we heard him answer it without breaking stride, one glove coming back to jam sealant tape over the seam while the other kept the bridle taut. 15 paces, 10-5, talking the whole time in that level freight handler's drone, "Holding fine, ma'am." Lots of margin, which the suit log later showed was spoken while the bag's pressure fell through the bottom of its band. He got her through the drop seal with the whistle still singing. The medics had her out of the bladder in 9 seconds. She was breathing. She had been breathing the whole way, and she said later that she had believed every word of the lie and that this was the kindest thing about it. He stood up from the bridle, retaped the seam square and slow, and went back across the stretch for Ada, 80 steps there, 80 steps back, while the children counted, and brought the old factor through the same singing rig without one word about the seam. The apron crews met them at the trunk mouth, because by then there were apron crews, OC 2 more human lashers up from the night shift, and a half ring of Vethri bonds mothers and dock wardens whom no one had allocated and no one dared disperse. Sendal 8, Ada Rendal 7. The chalk rasped twice. The knuckle taps had stopped being taps. The concourse simply struck the rail once altogether, a single deep note like a bell being tested each time the number fell. 7 souls. Then the actuary did the thing that put this morning into the law books of 3 species. Notice it said, and even its voice seemed to come from a different register, the cadence of a finding rather than a refusal. Model review complete. Operating assumption invalidated. The triage model assigns null value to voluntary re-entry of non-actionable compartments by rational agents. 9 recoveries by a single agent constitute proof of assumption failure. The model cannot rule on what it cannot model. Trig authority over Module 9 is suspended. Bulkhead 9 is unsealed. All assets released. I wrote it down with the time to the 10th of a second, and around me 600 Vethri stood in the roar of their own silence, watching the great bulkhead, sealed by law since the 41st minute, sealed while a man with chalk walked past it 16 times, shudder, and grind and open. You must understand what had actually happened inside that engine because it is the part the songs get wrong. The actuary did not feel anything. It was not shamed, not persuaded, not moved. Its model of the universe contained a theorem. No rational agent re-enters a compartment whose survival probability sits beneath threshold. Therefore, recovery operations cost net lives. Therefore, seal the door. Every datum of 2 centuries had confirmed it, because for 2 centuries every agent it had ever modeled had been Vethry, and we obey. Then a sub-Baseline cargo lasher wrote a number on its sealed door and falsified the theorem 9 times in one morning. And the engine, which cannot lie about data, did the only honest thing an honest calculator can do when its axiom dies in front of it. It abdicated. The human had not argued with our law for 1 second of that morning. He had simply kept generating evidence until the law's own mathematics surrendered. Mercer was at the sled when the bulkhead opened, sitting with his forearms on his knees, steam coming off the suit's shoulders into the bright air. He watched the medics pour through the gap, the drones spin up off their racks, the rescue flood toward the trunk that had been the world's only road for 4 hours. And what he said, the record holds it, the splice was live, was this. Good, now it's a proper dock. He stood, worked the burned glove back over the swelling in his left hand, and picked up his helmet. Pod first, I marked the route. 5 in the pod, then the courier girl, the elder. Nobody touches my number. I'm still the one walking it down. A medic supervisor began to object that the agent was injured and the agent's participation was no longer statistically necessary, and Dockmaster Wet, who had tried to arrest him, turned on the supervisor with his frill flat and said 5 words I never thought to hear from a dockmaster about a human. It is his count. Move. The pod was where the warden had said, amidships, lashed into a storage bay between 2 ribs of the module's spine, and the fire had walked over the top of it and moved on. Maru Ves Ada had chosen the bay because storage pods rate for hard vacuum, and their scrubbers run sealed. A Kresh elder, 81 years old, who had herded 5 younglings the length of a burning module and packed them in with the spare air bottles and the emergency paste and a glow lamp, and had them sing the counting rhyme while she dogged the lid, because a Vethry child who is counting is a Vethry child who is breathing slowly. The scrubber gauge, when Mercer's lamp found it, stood in the last red band. By the actuary's revised mathematics, the children had between 40 and 70 minutes of margin. They had been sealed for almost 5 hours. It took 3 of those minutes to clear the latch. The heat had crawled the bay and welded the rim seam, and we heard the pry bar, and we heard him talking the whole time, low and even through the pod's contact mic, the way he talked to nervous freight handlers. That singing I hear, keep it going, man's got to have a count to work to. And the splice carried it to the concourse. 5 small, smoke-free voices inside a steel box, singing the counting rhyme while the latch screamed and gave. They came out of the trunk one at a time, each one riding the humans back through the narrow leg with a drone lighting the way ahead, each one handed up into the daylight and a forest of reaching arms. 6. The bell strike of the rail. 5. Again. 4. 3. Again and again, and at the last of them, the smallest one, a girl of 5 named Emma, would not unhook her arms from the suit's neck ring, and the splice caught the exchange that every Vethry Kresh now hangs in needlework. Her small voice saying, "Is it my number now?" And the flat, tired voice answering, "Been your number all day, miss. I just had to come collect it." 2. 2 souls behind the wall. The chalk 2 stood on the bulkhead in the afternoon planet light, underlined, and beside the seam, the small notation Pod 5 now had a lasher's strike through it, load delivered, and the next name on the wall of my heart was Tessic, and no drone, no medic, and no count had yet found her at all. I broke my post then. I had stood at the rail for 5 hours keeping the secondary count, and I left it to a junior and crossed the apron to the trunk mouth because the next name was my clutch niece and I could not keep the record from 11 paces anymore. Nobody stopped me. The law that would have stopped me had abdicated an hour before. Mercer was at the sled, and for the first time that day, I saw the cost without telemetry translating it. The left hand had swollen inside its glove until the glove was the only thing holding its shape. The faceplate's lower quadrant was crazed white. He breathed in the careful, rationed way of a man whose ribs have opinions, and when he drank, his arms shook. Not from fear, I understood at last. The man simply had nothing left in that arm and was spending it anyway. "Register," he said. He had known my function all day. This was the first time he used it like a name. "Your girl, courier bond. Where on the module does a courier ride?" "The forward jump seats," I said. "By the document locker." She had pouches for the morning run. She always sat forward to be first off. My voice held because a registrar's voice is trained to hold. "Forward is the vacuum side." He nodded, the slow load count nod, and did not offer me one syllable of comfort, and I have been grateful for that for years. False odds would have been an insult to the count. Instead, he gave me the truth like freight. Drones swept forward and got nothing on thermals. But a drone reads heat and a cocoon sheds it. Your people's emergency cocoons, the membrane wraps. Courier kit carries one? 2, I said. Regulation. 2. Then forward's not empty till I've knocked on it. He stood up off the sled like a man lifting himself as his own last crate and went back into the wall. The forward search was the longest hour of the record. The splice carried it all. The vacuum stretch, the white stripe of planet light through the hull wound, the 4-wrap lashers knock on frame after frame after frame, each one answered by nothing. Nothing. The concourse stopped striking the rail. 600 Vethri and a row of human lashers stood in the afternoon glare and listened to a man knock on the doors of an airless steel corridor, patient as a tide, and I stood at the trunk mouth with my register against my chest and my stamp hand pressed flat against the hull, the accompaniment gesture, palm to metal, as if 11 years of certified manifest could conduct. At the 40th minute of the search, he found her satchel, and the whole ring learned what hope sounds like when it is rationed by a freight handler. The courier's satchel of the morning run, regulation orange, was wedged into the track of a jammed section door at forward 2, holding the door off its seat by the width of 3 fingers. He described it onto the channel the way he described everything, as lading, satchel. Courier contents intact, place not dropped, placed. A courier pinned nothing she could still carry. A courier wedged her satchel into a door track for one reason, because the door was trying to close between her and somewhere she needed to reach, and she had spent her most certified possession to keep 3 fingers of road open. She went forward of this door under her own power, the flat voice said. Door's been trying to shut on a mailbag for 6 hours, and the mailbag's winning. Good girl. Forward 3 next. On the concourse, 600 people looked at one registrar, and I put my stamp hand flat on the hull and left it there, and I do not remember breathing again until the knocking resumed. Twice in that last stretch, the actuary's voice came down quietly with revised figures, ambient cold, elapsed hours, cocoon endurance models, each estimate thinner than the one before, and I will record what the human did with them, because it is the whole man in one gesture, nothing. He did not acknowledge the broadcast, and he did not hurry. The knock, 4 raps, frame after frame, even as a metronome. He had told me once already that morning, without meaning to teach me anything. A count you reorder to suit your feelings stops being a count, and a search you hurry to suit your fear stops being a search. Frame, 4 raps, listen. Frame, 4 raps, listen. The knock that came back was so faint the splice barely held it. 2 raps, a stop, 1. Weak, he said on the channel, flat as ever, but moving now, fast. Jump seat frame, forward 3. Seat's gone over, stanchions down across it. She's cocooned underneath. And then the sound I will hear until my last filing, a pry bar ringing on a fallen stanchion in vacuum-carried conduction, over and over, while a man with one working hand and no arithmetic left in his body lifted a beam that the manual says wants 3 workers and a jack. He could not lift it. We heard him try 4 times. On the 5th, the drones reached him. The actuary, unasked, had rerouted every airframe drone on the ring to forward 3 the moment his channel said cocooned, and I record that because the engine gets no songs and it should get this much. It came when it could finally count what he counted. 3 drones took the stanchion's far end, the man took the near end on his shoulder, and the splice carried one long human sound of effort, the only such sound he made all day, and then, clear, she's clear, membranes intact, she's breathing. Tessic Oven Mira came up through bulkhead 9, through the door, the open lawful door, on a medic's frame at the 361st. Minute, gray with cold, her cocoon membrane glittering with frost, her pouch straps still buckled across her chest because my niece would know more. Shed certified male than the human would skip a number. She was breathing. She opened one eye at the daylight, found my sash in the crowd of faces, and said in a voice like a hinge, the sentence she still will not let me forget. Aunt Sarah, tell them I didn't break the courier seal. I am told I laughed. I have no memory of it. My register says, in handwriting I do not recognize as mine, recovered, soul 13 of 14 certified, alive, male intact. The bulkhead chalk, when I looked up, already read 1. And we all knew who the 1 was, and by then every soul on that concourse knew the shape of what was coming, because the pod children had been telling it since they came out. The elder sealed us in. The elder gave us the bottles. The elder dogged the lid from outside. From outside, Mercer stood at the open bulkhead for a moment, looking at the chalk 1, and then he did something he had not done all day. He took off the rebuilt suit's helmet, left it on the sled, and put on instead a plain breather mask from the medic's rack, the modules amidships. Held air again, the drones had patched and pumped it. There was no fire left to armor against. He went in through the door like a visitor, slow, his burned hand carried against his chest, and a single drone went ahead of him with a lamp. And the splice stayed live because nobody on that ring would have dared to cut it. He found Maru Ves Ada where everyone already understood she would be, at the storage bay, below the pod's latch, sitting against the rib of the spine with her hands folded in her lap, her work done. The bay had held heat shadow and thin air, enough for a sealed pod, never enough for an open-masked elder, and she had known it when she dogged the lid, and she had sat down where her hands could stay near the latch in case any small voice needed to hear. Knuckles' answer. And the cold had taken her sometime in the second hour, while the singing on the other side of the steel kept the count. The concourse heard the humans report 2 words, the flattest I ever heard his flat voice go. Found her. Nothing else for a moment, then. I'm bringing her out. She goes in the count like everybody. 0 means nobody's behind the door. It doesn't mean everybody made it. Tell the families to stand at the rail. He would not let the drones take her, and the medics by then knew better than to ask. He carried Maru Ves Ada out through Bulkhead 9 in his arms, walking slowly in the late planet light, an old human in a scorched suit carrying an old Vethri in her Kresh Elder's gray, her arms composed across her chest by his one good hand before he lifted her, because lashers secure a load before it moves. The families stood at the rail. 600 Vethri pressed their palms flat to whatever was nearest, glass, deck, each other. And the dock wardens came to attention in the manner of honors. And Hildemar Wet's frill went all the way down. The deep bow our people give once or twice in a life. He gave her to the medics the way he had set down the first child of the morning, slowly, watching his hands until the weight was off them. Then he walked to the bulkhead, and the whole ring was so quiet I could hear the chalk come out of the pouch. He wiped the one away, and he wrote, slowly squarely, with the underline drawn twice beneath it, with 7 hours in every trip and 1 death in the strokes of it, a 0. Counts closed, Dale Mercer said. To the door, to the day, to nobody. 14 aboard, 2 found extra, 15 breathing, 1 carried home. Nothing left behind. Then he sat down on the deck where he stood, in the planet light, with his back against the wall under the 0, and asked, in the same flat voice, whether anybody on this dock had ever heard of a chair. Somebody found him a chair. It is in the record, because everything from that day is in the record. A folding dock steward's chair, carried at a run by 3 younglings who fought over the honor the whole way, and he sat on it under the 0 with his helmet on the deck beside him, and for a while the ring simply let him breathe. The medics came in a wave then, freed by an unsealed door and an abdicated ruling, and he waved them off his own body twice. Survivors first, I'm freight that can wait. Until the supervisor, who had objected at the bulkhead and been turned by what he had spent the day watching, crouched in front of the chair and played the only card that ever worked on the man. Every survivor is stabilized, the supervisor said. You are the last open line on today's manifest, Lasher. The count isn't closed while you're bleeding on it. Mercer looked at him for a moment, registered the shape of his own argument coming back at him, and said, That's a dirty trick, Doctor, and gave the medics his arm. While they cut the suit off him, Dockmaster Wet came to the door with his duty slate and did the thing his office required, in front of everyone. In the formal voice that carries to the rails, he closed the operation. Our docks close every operation allowed. It is how a shift knows the weight is down. He read the hours. He read the souls. And then where the form says state the outcome, Heil Damar Wet looked at the chalk 0 for a long moment, and at the man under it having burned dressing wound onto a ruined hand, and he did not use any of the lawful phrases, casualty event resolved, incident concluded, losses within parameters. He spoke 3 sentences onto his own seal, and they are the sentences his rank will be remembered by when every other act of his career has gone to the archive dust. Operation concluded. Cargo account balanced, no discrepancy. The actuary spoke once more that evening, and I will close the day's pages with it, because the order of those 2 voices, the dock masters, then the engines, is the order history actually happened in, whatever the songs say. The broadcast came down the concourse in the level tone it uses for weather and tariffs. Incident review, final annotation. Agent Mercer, survival probability at first entry 11%. Survival outcome, realized. The model notes for the record that the agent was advised of the probability and proceeded. The model has no category for this annotation. It is filed under variance, pending amendment. Filed under variance, pending amendment. 600 Vethri looked at one another in the evening planet light, and the laughter that went down that gallery was quiet and ragged and very near to something else, because our law had just admitted in its own dry grammar that a human dock lasher had happened to it and that it intended to study him. He slept before they had the second dressing on. Sat in a steward's folding chair under a chalk 0 with 600 of my people watching, and simply went out, mid-evening, the way a crane powers down, and the medics lifted him onto the frame he had refused, and nobody anywhere made a joke of it. As they wheeled him up the concourse, the crowd did the thing I have never managed to describe to off-worlders so that they understand the size of it. No cheering. We are not a cheering people, and besides, he was asleep. They simply parted, all 600, and as the frame passed, each of them reached out and touched the rail he rolled along. Not him, the rail, the steel that had carried the Count's keeper. One palm after another, the accompaniment gesture given to a moving thing, the whole length of the morning concourse, and the last to do it was Pelle Andresu, 6 years old, scorch-marked and wrapped in a thermal sheet in his bondmother's arms, who had been the first number wiped off the door. I stayed at the bulkhead until the night watch, finishing the pages. Osi found me there. He stood looking at the zero for a while, hands in his work belt, and then he told me the thing I have thought about on every watch of every year, since the thing I entered into the register as the day's final line, because a registrar files what is true, and that was the truest sentence spoken, on Sendavile that day. You're going to want to make this about him being special, Osi said. Don't. Dale's the most ordinary man I ever worked a dock with. That's the part you people need to write down. Where we come from, that, he nodded at the door, the number, all of it, that's just the job. You don't leave the Count open. Any lasher on any world would tell you the same. I wrote it down. I have been 40 years deciding whether I believe it, and I have settled here. I believe that he believed it, and I believe his whole species believes it, and I believe that this, a civilization that files its highest virtue under ordinary, is the single, most dangerous and most beautiful fact my people have ever logged about yours. They took him to the medical ring on a frame he kept trying to get off of, on the grounds that frames were for freight and he could walk, which was a lie his legs disproved twice before the medics won. The inventory of him, entered into evidence later, reads like a salvage report. Deep burns along the left shin and forearm, 3 fingers of the left hand crushed where the stanchion had settled before the drones arrived, 2 ribs cracked, the lungs insulted by smoke down to a depth the scans measured in years, and a level of systemic exhaustion that our physicians, who had never treated a human, kept rerunning because they did not believe a body presenting those numbers had been walking, let alone lifting. The attending physician's note became famous on the ring before the night watch ended. Patient's vitals are inconsistent with patient's activity log. One of the two must be wrong. Both have been verified. The zero stayed on the bulkhead. A maintenance crew arrived at the next watch with solvent and orders to restore the surface, and a dock warden, not wet, a young one, a warden whose name I never learned, stood in front of the door and informed them that the surface was under registry seal as evidence in an open incident file. There was no such seal. I created it retroactively the moment I heard, dated to the 10th of a second, and if you want to call that the first dishonest act of my career, I will not argue, but no solvent touched that door. The families came all through the night watch. I stayed because the register was not finished, and account is not closed until it is filed, and so I saw it. Vethri in their home clothes coming down the bright nightside concourse in 1s and 2s, standing before a scorched bulkhead with a chalk 0 on it, pressing their palms flat against the cold steel beside it, not on the 0. None of them ever touched the 0. Beside it, where the Count could feel the accompaniment without being smudged. Ira set on came with her bond house. The fuel crewman Casselum came alone, stood a long time, and left a lasher's chalk, a human's chalk, begged from Osi, on the deck lip below the door, the way his fuel house people leave a tool on a grave so the dead have something to work with. By morning there were 40 chalks lined along that lip. By the inquest there were 1,000, and they had begun to arrive by mail. I want to tell you the ring rose up in gratitude with one voice, and the story marched straight to its honors. The record says otherwise, and I am a registrar. We file what happened. What happened is that on the second day, the Provincial Directorate of Hethkar filed charges. 16 counts of violation of a binding triage ruling, 1 for each transit of the sealed casualty boundary their auditors could document. 1 count of unauthorized hazardous operation on compact equipment. 1 count, and this was the one with teeth in it, of incitement of public obstruction, which named no one else but described, in the bloodless glyphs of a charge sheet, 600 citizens, a dockmaster who converted an arrest into a witnessing, and a registrar whose secondary count had, quote, lent administrative color to an unlawful act, unquote. I read my own actions in a charge sheet against a man in a burn ward, and I sat in my office in the morning planet light, and I was ashamed of my province in a way I had not known a Vethri could be ashamed of law. And behind the charges stood the true stake, the one the Directorate's filings circled the way a current circles a drain. If one unmodeled agent could nullify a triage engine by walking past it, then every actuary on every ring above Hethkar was now, in the filings language, a structure with a known bypass. The Directorate's remedy was not subtle. Suspend the Outworld Labor Compact, ring-wide pending review, remove the humans. Not punish them, remove them. The way you remove an unshielded cable. There were 940 human laborers on the rings of Hethkar, and the cost of one morning's 15 lives was to be all of them, billed and shipped, because our finest legal minds had looked at a man who did not skip numbers and concluded that the safest available future was one with no such men in it. I took the charge sheet to the burn ward myself. I felt the count was owed that much, that he hear it from the keeper of the secondary record, and not from a wall screen. He was sitting up, the ruined hand in a regrowth sheath, eating with the other one, and the first thing he asked me was whether the morning tier had shipped on schedule, because his shift had been due on Dock 4 at the 6th hour, and he had, his words, left them short-handed. I told him Dock 4 had shipped on schedule. He nodded the load count nod. Then I read him the charges, all 18 of them, in the formal cadence, because reading documents truly is the only ceremony I own, and he ate his ration through the whole recitation, and the only time he stopped chewing was the incitement count, the one that described Wet and the bonds mothers and me. That one's wrong, he said. Rest of it's accurate. I did cross their line 16 times. Somebody ought to write that down properly. But nobody on that dock did a thing because of me. He looked at the window, the planet filling it, the morning side. They did it because the number was true and they could all see it. You can't incite people with a count. You can only show them what's still on the board. I asked him, because the registrar in me has no manners, whether he understood that the directorate meant to remove every human on the ring and that his 16 transits were the instrument, and that some of his own people on Dock 4 were afraid of him now in a way no Vethri was. He was quiet for a moment, the long, unhurried quiet he put in front of anything that deserved weight. 26 years back, he said, I failed your aptitude test 3 times. You know what's on it? Pattern puzzles, glyph games, spin this shape in your head. Not one question about whether you bring your people home. He set the ration down. Your machine and your directorate and your test all run on the same arithmetic registrar. Smart, fast, and it works fine right up until somebody's behind a door. I'm not against it. Most days I load freight under it and it does right by me. But it's got one hole in it, always has, and the hole is, he held up the chalk. Someone had brought him his chalk. It lay on the blanket like a small white instrument. It thinks a number with people in it is the same kind of number as the other kind. It is not the same kind of number. That's the whole of what I know. And I had to come out here 26 years to find a place where knowing it was worth a damn. It is the longest speech in the record of him, and he gave it to an audience of one registrar with a slate, and then he asked if I would mind handing him the water. The inquest convened 12 days later in the Chamber of Findings, the high room at the ring's crown where the glass goes all the way over, and Hethkar's daylight stands in the room like a 10th magistrate. They wheeled him in because the legs were still rebuilding, and he wore his dock coverall cleaned and pressed, because he owned nothing formal and had declined politely the advocate's offer of better. The gallery held the largest assembly in the ring's history. The 14 names of my manifest sat in the first row, 13 of them breathing, and for Maruves Ada, her creche daughters, holding her elders' grey folded on their knees. Behind them the pod children in a row like rivets. Behind them everyone. And on the evidence stand at the chamber's center, under seal, lifted whole out of the wall by a cutting crew on the directorate's own order, because the prosecution wanted the jury of magistrates to see the unlawful act itself, stood the door. Bulkhead 9 scorched 4 times a man's height, with a chalk 0 on its face, underlined twice. The directorate had brought it to convict him with. I watched the magistrates look at it as it was unveiled, and I knew, the way a registrar knows a falsified ledger at a glance, that someone in that prosecution office had just made the largest clerical error of the age. The prosecution's case took the morning, and I will summarize it fairly, because it deserves fairness. It was correct. Every clause of it. The directorate's advocate was a careful, gray-frilled jurist named Pellerant Vey, and she did not rant and she did not sneer. She stood in the daylight of the Chamber of Findings and built her wall one true stone at a time. The triage law had saved, by conservative actuarial reckoning, 200,000 Vethri lives in 2 centuries. It worked because it was absolute. An absolute that admits exceptions is not an absolute. It is an argument. And arguments at airlocks are how the Vale stations died. The agent had survived on a probability the actuary itself had set at 11%, which meant, she said, that in 9 out of 11 adjacent worlds the chamber was holding this inquest over 16 bodies instead of 1, and the chalk on that door had stopped at some number greater than 0, and the gallery, now weeping with gratitude, would instead be demanding to know why the law had permitted a man to die writing it. One soul, she reminded the chamber, had died regardless. The law was not on trial, she said. The law cannot be on trial. The alternative to the law is the night the law was written to end. She was correct. I ask you to hold that in one hand for the rest of this account, The prosecution was correct, and it lost anyway. And the reason it lost is the thing I have spent the years since trying to put into the training of every registrar who passes under my stamp. Dockmaster Wet testified first for the defense, in full dock regalia, and entered into the record the official operations log of the incident, which he had signed. The log was a dockmaster's plain chronology, and its final line, written in his own authority and over his own seal, read, "Operation concluded. Cargo account balanced. No discrepancy." The advocate Vey objected that souls were not cargo. Wet looked at her for a long moment with his frill at the neutral angle and replied that on his dock, cargo meant anything entrusted to it that must not be lost, and that he had chosen the word with care and that he would stand by his lading. The magistrates let it stand. It stands today. The medic supervisor testified, the same one who had objected at the bulkhead, and surprised the chamber by being for the defense, too. He had reviewed every recovered patient. He wished the record to show a clinical finding. Of the 15 souls recovered alive, 11 would not have survived to the unsealing on their own margins. He had brought charts. He was a man rebuilding his own certainties in public, joint by joint, and the chamber heard him out in silence. Warden Celis Marodin testified in her creche graze with her voice still smoke-scared, and she did not talk about the human at all, which was the most useful thing anyone did for him in 5 days. She talked about triage from underneath. She had heard the sealing broadcast from inside Module 9. She said, the compartments carry the public channel, and she wished the chamber to understand, as a sworn professional of the creche service, what the law's voice sounds like when you are lying in bad air, listening to it withhold the assets, with 6 younglings breathing in your charge. She said our law had been, until that morning, a wall with no inside surface, built by people who always imagined themselves on the breathing side of it. She said the chalk number was the first time in her life the inside of the wall had a window. The advocate Vey correctly objected that sentiment was not evidence. The presiding magistrate, in one of the 2 rulings of his career that are taught, replied that the witness was a sworn officer of the creche service reporting observed conditions inside a casualty compartment, and that the condition she had observed was despair, and its partial relief, and both were facts with timestamps, and the objection was denied. And the pod children were not called. Our law spares the under 10s. But Imiset was in the gallery's first row that afternoon, and when the warden stepped down, the girl stood up on her seat before her bondmother could reach her and held up, in one small fist, for the magistrates and the cameras and the species to see, a stub of Dockhand's chalk. She said nothing. She had rehearsed nothing. She held it up the way you hold up the one piece of evidence that matters, and then she sat down again. And the presiding magistrate did not gavel it out of the record, and so it is in the record, unsworn, 3 seconds long, the shortest testimony in the history of the Chamber of Findings, and the only one I have ever watched change the angle of every frill on the bench at once. Then it was mine. I will not pretend modesty about what I did in that chamber, because it was not mine to be modest about. It was the Count's. I carried the register to the stand, the physical book, because I keep the physical book. Paper survives power loss, and so do promises. And I asked the presiding magistrate for an indulgence our procedure allows and almost no one invokes, that an official record be read aloud and unabridged into a finding. The magistrate granted it, and I stood in the planet light of that high room, and I read my people the morning, timestamp by timestamp, to the 10th of a second. Entry of Agent Human Mercer D. Trunk C11, souls aboard. 14 recovered Pelandra Sue, 6 years breathing. Chalk amended to 13. Actuary broadcast, threshold unmet. Bulkhead remains sealed. Recovered Celis Marodin, warden, breathing 12. I read all of it. The arrest that became a witnessing. The pod 5 chalked small along a seam. The revision upward to 11. Good catch, Dockmaster. Worse to find out after 0. The 4-rap knock and the 4 raps that answered it. The engine's abdication in the engine's own syntax. The counting rhyme. Is it my number now? The 2 raps in the 1. Male intact. Founder. She goes in the count like everybody. Each name with its number. Each number with its 10th of a second, 40 minutes of unbroken reading, and no one in the Chamber of Findings moved, because my people will stand and fire for a true ledger. It is the best of what we are. And for the first time in our history, the truest ledger anyone had ever heard had a human inside it all the way down. When I finished, I closed the book, and into the silence I said the only sentence of my own that I permitted myself, and it entered the finding, and I am told it is now carved where registrars take their oath on 4 rings, which embarrasses me and would bore him. The record reflects that the law counted probabilities, and the human counted souls, and only one of those ledgers balanced by nightfall. The actuary submitted last. It cannot appear. It has no body to bring. Its custodians read its statement, and the chamber that had sat unmoved through advocates and survivors shifted like a hull under stress for this, because no Vethri living had heard an actuary speak outside its function. The statement was 4 findings long. Finding 1. Its triage model had rested, since commissioning, on the axiom that no rational agent voluntarily enters a compartment below threshold. The axiom was inherited from observed Vethri behavior across 2 centuries and had never once been tested against a negative case because no negative case had ever presented. Finding 2, on the morning in question the axiom was falsified 16 times by a single agent of sub-baseline cognitive classification, and the model's subsequent rulings were therefore computed on a dead assumption, and every one of them after the first recovery was, in the engine's own words, arithmetically void. Finding 3, had the agent complied with lawful broadcast instruction, recoverable souls numbering between 9 and 13 would have been written off as actuarial remainder. The engine had run the counter history 40,000 times. It submitted the distribution as an exhibit. Finding 4, and the custodian reading it paused before this one, and the chamber has argued ever since about whether what it felt in that pause was projection. The model notes that the agent employed a counting protocol of total enumeration, no soul ranked above any other, no entry skipped, terminating only at 0, and that this protocol, while computationally trivial, is not representable within the model's value architecture. The model can rank lives. It cannot, within its current law, refuse to. Recommend amendment. 2 glyphs from the machine they had built to be the law's own arithmetic. The directorate's advocate sat looking at her own evidence, the great scorched door with its 0, hauled into the chamber to prove 16 crossings of a sealed line, and I watched her understand what the prosecution office had not. That every magistrate had spent 2 days looking past her careful stones at a chalk 0 underlined twice, and that you cannot convict a closed count in front of the families it closed. They called him on the 3rd day. He took the stand out of the chair, on his own feet, because the legs had rebuilt enough for that, and he had been counting the days until they would, and he stood in the daylight under the glass with his dock coverall pressed and his ruined hand in its sheath, and he took our oath of true accounting without a tremor, and the presiding magistrate, in a gesture no protocol office had sanctioned, asked the witness whether he would prefer to sit. "I'm all right, Your Honor," he said. "I've stood longer shifts than this one." The defense advocate asked him almost nothing. She had watched the chamber for 2 days, and she understood that her client's entire case was the way he answered things, and so she asked him only the one question the finding needed on its face, but why the chalk? He thought about it the way he thought about everything. With his hands still and his time unhurried, 600 people in the gallery and the planet's daylight standing in the room, and what he finally said is on the chamber wall now, cut into the stone facing, and I will set it down here exactly because I was 11 paces away with the register open, and I took it at dictation, speed as the words landed. "On a dock," he said, "crates get numbers. Every crate, every time, chalked where the whole shift can see it, and the stack isn't cleared till the count says 0. We do that for freight, boxes of machine parts, bolt stock, dried rations." The pause was long enough that the recorder's light blinked. "Your machine had 14 people behind a door, and it filed them under acceptable. I've never once been allowed to file a crate under acceptable, so I gave them what crates get. A number on the door where everybody could watch it come down. People deserve at least what crates get. I don't know a thing I believe harder than that, and I had to come 26 years across the dark to find out it needed saying." Advocate Vey rose for the cross. She was, as I have said, careful and correct, and she asked the question her whole case rested on, the one I am still asked by every cadet class. Was the witness aware, at his first entry, that his own survival probability stood at 11%? Was he aware that his example, repeated by others less capable, would kill them? That the law he bypassed exists because most agents who re-enter die and take their rescuers with them? "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Heard it broadcast. 11%. And did the witness consider that figure acceptable?" "No, ma'am. I considered it mine." He shifted the sheathed hand slightly, the only gesture of the deposition. "That's the piece your engine had backwards, if you want it for your files. It spent all morning telling me the odds on those people's lives like that settled something. Odds on my life were the only ones it quoted that were mine to spend, and I spent them, and the rest was never odds at all. It was a count. You don't gamble a count, you just keep it." She asked one more. She was too honest a jurist not to ask it. "One soul died regardless," she said. "The elder. If the protocol of total enumeration is so superior, account for Maru Ves Ada." The chamber went very still. The particular stillness of 600 people who would have protected him from the question if our law allowed. He did not need protecting. "Can't account for her," he said. "Won't try. She was gone 2 hours before I ever picked up the chalk. Your own scans say so. What I can tell you is what she'd already done by then. She had 5 kids in one pod and air enough for 5, and she ran the same count I did and came out the same place. Everybody in, nothing left behind, and the only life she had spared to spend was hers. For the first and only time in the record, his voice put weight on a word. I didn't carry her out because the count made me, ma'am. I carried her out because she finished hers. Advocate Vey looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, no further questions, and sat down, and those who were watching her instead of him, I was. A registrar watches the whole ledger, saw her press her palm flat against the advocate's table briefly, the accompaniment gesture, before she squared her files. The finding came down on the 5th day. Our findings are not verdicts of mercy. The magistrates did not forgive the 16 transits. They did something our jurisprudence respects infinitely more. They re-derived the law. The finding of the chamber holds, first, that a binding triage ruling allocates the resources and citizens of the ring and cannot, by its own founding logic, allocate an agent who volunteers his soul and separate life against a sealed account. Such an agent is not a breach of triage but a new asset entering the ledger, and the law must count him, not claim him. Second, that every triage engine of the province would be re-axiomed within the year to model voluntary re-entry, and that the engine's rulings would henceforth carry a posted soul count, publicly displayed at the boundary of any sealed compartment where the families can read it, because, the finding says in the driest legal glyphs imaginable, concealment of the count was found to serve the model's authority rather than the soul's enumerated. And third, the clause the lashers got to first, the clause that is chalked in small numerals inside every airlock on 4 rings, the clause our jurists formally cite as Finding 9 Send a Veil, and everyone else on every dock alive calls the chalk clause, that no enumeration of living souls shall be closed at any number above 0 while a willing keeper of the count remains. All charges were dissolved into the finding. The compact suspension died in committee on Hethkar within the month, quietly, the way wrong things die when no one will stand up in daylight to be seen feeding them. 940 humans stayed at their work. The directorate paid for the door, because the door never went back. Engineering crews fitted Module 9's rebuilt frame with new steel and the old bulkhead, scorched, seal-scared, with 16 transits worth of law broken against it and a chalk 0 underlined twice, was mounted whole in the morning concourse of Sendavale, under hard glass, with the chalk sealed beneath a fixative our archivists formulated for that one purpose and have since shipped to 4 rings for purposes like it. The lip below the glass holds the chalks. They still come by mail. The plaque is small, because he reviewed the draft himself in the burn ward, struck out the word hero with his good hand, struck out the word miracle, struck out, to the lasting grief of the carvers, his own name, and approved in the end a single line of trade glyphs that visiting species sometimes mistake for an error of translation, and every dockhand who reads it knows better. 14 aboard. 2 found extra. 15 breathing. 1 carried home. Nothing left behind. He worked 9 more years on Dock 4. That is the part the visiting correspondents never believed. That the man in the finding went back to lashing freight at the 6th hour, with a rebuilt hand that ached in the cold of the outer tiers, and turned down the supervisory grade twice on the grounds that supervisors don't keep their own counts, and ate his midday ration on the same bench facing the same glass. And if you sat with him and asked about the morning, cadets did constantly. I sent them. He would answer any question put to him plainly, and at no great length, and then ask whether they were keeping up with their bottle drills. I will give you one more entry from those years, because it closes a ledger this account opened and no other account bothers to. When the re-axiomed actuary came back online, 14 months of rework, its triage architecture rebuilt around the amendment. Protocol required it to verify the census of registered agents on the ring, and so, at the 6th hour of an ordinary morning watch, its voice came down Dock 4 for the first time since the morning of the door, and 600 stevedores stopped dead, and it said, Census Verification, Mercer D, Human Contract Labor, Classification Revised, Modeled Agent, Modeling Basis, Total Enumeration, Voluntary Reentry, Keeper of Count. The engine paused. Engines do not pause. Its custodians swear the log shows computation, not theater, and then it finished the entry in its level, weightless voice. Model notes this agent will not comply with future write-off rulings. Future rulings will be computed accordingly. He is in its mathematics now. They built the new architecture with a term in it for a man who walks past sealed doors with chalk, because the honest engine refused to be wrong in the same place twice. Mercer listened to the whole broadcast leaning on a crate stack, and when it ended he said, to the dock at large, about time it learned to count and sign for the morning tier. The pod children grew up on that ring. Immaset, the small one who would not let go of the neck ring, stood her registrar's oath under my stamp 11 years later, and keeps on the desk that used to be mine a stub of dockhand's chalk that she did not get from me. He died in his sleep, in his bunk on the ring, an old man at the end of a paid-out contract, 20 years almost to the watch after the morning of the door. And I will tell you what the Rings of Hethkar did, because it is the last entry, and the register is not closed until it is filed. No state honors. He had filed his objection to those in advance in writing, with my office, correctly stamped, the only document I ever notarized while unable to see the page. Instead, at the 6th hour of the morning watch, every dock on every ring of this world stopped, and at the boundary of every airlock, on the steel beside the seal, every lasher and warden and medic and registrar of 2 species took up chalk and wrote the count of every soul aboard their station and underlined it, so that for one watch the whole orbit of Hethkar stood enumerated in Dockhand's chalk. Millions counted, everyone, and then we went back to work because he would have asked us, in that flat, unhurried voice, who was minding the freight. The 0 is still on the door. I am registrar first grade now, gray in the frill, and I walk the new cadets down the morning concourse on their first watch, every class, and I stand them in the planet light in front of the glass, and I give them the only oath lesson I have ever needed. Our law can rank anything, I tell them. It is brilliant, mind it well. But the door will teach you the one thing the law had to be taught by a man our examiners filed under baseline, that a number with people in it is not the same kind of number, and that it counts to 0, and no further, and never down to acceptable. And when they ask me, one of them always asks, what they should do if they are ever the keeper of such a count. I tell them what he told the doc the first time the chalk touched the steel, 11 paces from where I stood. Before any of us understood, we were watching our own law learn to count. Somebody keep count, he said, in case my chalk breaks. Keep it all the way to 0, nothing left behind.